Jesus, Canada, you get such a weird, twisted psychology sometimes.
Paddy Cosgrave seemed a little nervous. It was the first time we had sat down for a conversation since 2018, before Collision's first appearance in Canada in 2019, and shortly after Toronto had been named as the host city. And things didn't go perfectly out of the gate in 2019, and we all know what happened in the years to follow. In fact, today, Cosgrave just published a post revealing how his company almost went bust in 2020. So, in our conversation recorded just a week before Collision 2022, Cosgrave was aware of the need for the conference to make a second first impression. On this episode, we discussed that, as well as running a conference that doesn't turn a profit, how Collision has changed from its 2019 iteration, and the value proposition of IRL tech events post-pandemic, particularly for one that's expecting 35,000 people, which is 40% more than the last time it was IRL. But that's not all that we talked about. You see, Paddy is a forthright lad, one with a sophisticated and global perspective on the current state of tech. So I took complete advantage of the opportunity to get his take on a variety of subjects, including the current tech downturn and Canadian tech's capacity to handle the pressure. Cosgrave had a lot to say on that last topic, particularly related to Shopify. Now, Shopify doesn't seem to be participating too much in Collision this year, but it is an interesting question. Why does the co-founder of some of the largest technology conferences in the world think Canadian tech can't handle, in his words, getting smacked around on stage a bit? Let's dig in.
Well, Paddy, how has the last 2 years been for you, man?
The last 2 years have been radically different when you organize something that brings together tens of thousands of people from all over the world into a massive indoor space. It's like the ultimate petri dish. And so understandably, large global events have been shuttered completely. It was a wild ride. There were moments when it wasn't clear that we'd make it through. We took a lot of gambles and we got very lucky, and we've come out the other side and things seem to be, touch wood, booming a little bit.
Yeah,
So
there's some energy, there's some anticipation for sure, particularly from the local community here. I feel an obligation for anyone that we have back on the podcast who we last talked to before the pandemic to kind of trace the delta between those years and what's happened. So can you, like, for people who weren't paying attention and were, either living their lives or trying to live their lives, walk through the transition from having the first year in Canada happen in Toronto, kind of just touching down, feeling out the water. Is it warm? Okay, next year is going to be really big. And then having to make that transition. What was it like transitioning to a major local event to something that was not?
yeah, so we had to shift online. We got very lucky that we've built software for years. So we ran everything on our own platform. A lot of the software had been built over many years, but we just didn't have the sort of video streaming component or VoIP component, which we built in about 6 weeks. So when we unveiled it for Collision, it was fine, very rough. And then it became a lot better over the year afterwards. So the second time we did Collision online, which was in 2021, I think it was a much better experience. But I have to say, running an event for the first time in a city is very daunting. You've no idea how it's going to work out. I think it worked out reasonably well.
We had to show your boy Keith all the good pubs when he first came here.
Yeah. And so there was momentum, and to only have got to run Collision once in Toronto, and now effectively 3 years later we're back. That's a little bit kind of scary because it's sort of the momentum killer. But we seem to have been lucky in that their number of attendees in 2019 was about 25,000. We will pass 35,000 tomorrow, and we're just going to shut off all tickets because I think there's a degree of uncertainty. I'm not clear how busy the venue is going to be. We've taken a lot of additional space, so increased the amount of space we've taken or using by about 50%, but I'm not too sure in a lot of key areas. I think it's just going to be very, very busy, which if you're an exhibitor and the floor is packed and there are queues, you're loving life. But if you're an attendee and there's a lot of queues and the floor is completely packed, you're not loving life so much. So
Yeah.
you got to find a bit of a kind of happy medium. It's going to be very, very busy.
So is that purely a health and safety consideration in terms of expanding the space? Like we've talked to other events that have came back IRL at the end of last year, particularly right before Omicron. So everyone was like, "Hey, we're good, double vax, things are fine," and they were also very cautious in terms of understanding people's sensibilities. Is this more of a giving everyone extra room to kind of figure this out? Like we spent 10 minutes before we started recording talk about how we don't know how to be social with each other in person.
Sure.
So I assume that's part of it.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great point. One of the things that we're doing that we didn't do in 2019 is we're creating a huge outdoor space, because I think there are some people who may come to the event. I might be, one of those people. And if there are areas where there's just tons of people, I think by and large, most people are now fine with that. There will be other people who kind of self-select and go, hey, let's just do the meeting outside. So we have a huge kind of outdoor space. We've got lots of food trucks. It should be very social, great for meeting people. And that helps, I think, disperse crowds massively and gives people a kind of a safe place, if you want to use it, to do their meetings if they so wish.
So I guess one of the benefits also is like moving the event to June, which I think was always the plan for kind of year 2 and beyond, is that you're actually going to get the lovely Toronto weather that Torontonians talk to people about, but no one outside of the city has ever seen or believes exists.
The weather's just so perfect. Coming from Ireland, the idea that it's like 22 degrees is just like the most, right now is the most optimal experience. And I think people will love it, provided the weather holds, which I think it's going to.
Of course, knock on wood. Is there anything else that you're doing from like a health and safety protocol? And I think at this point, there are rumors about what the federal government's going to do in Canada in terms of like vaccine mandates and things like that. Obviously, in the province of Ontario, they've completely thrown up their hands and completely given up trying, right? I don't want to push you too hard on this, but I think maybe for listeners who are thinking to attend, like, are there steps that you're taking that might lead them to feel more comfortable?
It's a very good question. I mean, our obligation is to, wherever we run an event, we ran an event in November in Portugal, and we just work with the, if it's a local city or it's a federal health service, that we adhere to all of their rules. I think that's the minimum requirement, and that's what we're doing in this instance.
Do you have an internal baseline that might be like above those standards?
In Lisbon, we did, and in Toronto, we don't. I sort of think, nobody's forcing you to go to a large event at this point, and if you're up for it, come along. And if you at any time get a little bit, I'm not so sure about this, there seems to be a lot of people, we've created a massive outdoor area where by and large you should be absolutely fine based on the science.
Yeah. Let's go back to the transition from like digital to IRL again. Is there anything that you're taking from that period, either tech-wise or like even approach, that you're now applying to in person? Because I'm very interested, like you're saying, oh yeah, we had to build that technology in 6 weeks. That's nuts for most companies, let alone an event company, right? So like what are you bringing to the fore this year that might have been kind of battle tested over the last 2 years?
Yeah, there's lots of new features and enriched features within the software. I will say that I won't say I'm a virtual conference denier, but I'm as close to being a virtual conference denier as you could imagine. We have the software. We've sold that software to the UN, to the Consumer Electronics Show, to lots of other people. I do believe online conference software can serve a particular purpose, but I think it's in many ways radically different to an IRL event. An IRL event is incredibly rich. And the software that we build to enable people or help people that attend an event in the real world is designed to enable people to meet each other. So most of the features are directing people to very easily connect and schedule meetings in the real world, whereas online we were doing something I think kind of somewhat different. So there's some features like Mingle that will be available to people who might want to kind of mingle online. These are these kind of rapid 3-minute kind of hangouts, and we match you with the next best person that we can find in the pool of 800 or 5,000 people.
Re-socializing event attendees to talk to people again?
Yeah, exactly. But I am as close to a virtual conference skeptic as you're going to meet, and that seems completely inane or silly given that we built what the editor-at-large of TechCrunch, for example, Mike Butcher, is adamant is the best platform out there. I just think real-world events are radically different, and I think they're far more worthwhile. I certainly got very jaded by online conferences over the last 2 years.
Okay, so let's talk about the process then of bringing people here to Toronto and to Canada. Like Canada has had, and Toronto and Ontario in particular, a really, really weird pandemic. We've been kind of like one of the most locked down places in the world. My perspective on this is a little skewed. What has it been like convincing speakers from around the world or just North America to come here for this event?
Yeah,
like,
yeah.
Has it been
Yeah,
having to
sure.
convince it? 'Cause
A lot of people would perceive Canada as very like China. Obviously, Canada's massively influenced by China and copies a lot of what China does. That may not be the perception internal to Canada, but I think a lot of people think that Canada looks to China for inspiration. I'm joking somewhat here.
We were talking about Irish politics before, so I was like,
Yeah,
I could just be misreading this. This might be a Fox News joke. I hope we're going there. I know there's a subset of Twitter that certainly thinks that everyone had to go into their own bubble for the last 2 years, and then inside that bubble, reality changed. So I don't know if it's easy for you to get
No,
the global tech people to come here. Or they're like, finally, I would love to go to Canada again.
Yeah, I think Canadians like to beat themselves up a little bit too much. Canadians are, to begin with,
Undeniably.
very humble. I think sometimes where a lot of Canadian startups fail, I've seen the interactions myself firsthand. American VC comes up from Silicon Valley and it's like, hey guys, how's everything going? And an American startup, a US startup will say, oh, amazing, we're just knocking out of the park. And a Canadian startup is like, oh yeah, real good. Like, it's just great to still be around. We've really been struggling over the last 12 months, but we're just chuffed to still be here. And that's the kind of, the Canadian mentality it's great, but there's a lot of humility and Canadians love to beat up on themselves. And I think externally, actually, the perception of Canada is incredibly positive. Toronto's the most cosmopolitan city in the world. People like to come here you mightn't think it's the best run city in the world, but actually compared to many other cities in North America, especially below the border, it is a remarkably well run and tidy and clean and safe city where a lot of people want to move to.
All my family lives in the US, so I can both agree with you and disagree with you. I hear that. But okay, so then in terms of beyond the social context or the perception, practically, has there been situations where you're like, oh yes, we finally booked the CEO of so-and-so, great, and they're like, oh, I can't go across the border during this circumstance? Have you been involved with the logistics of bringing people here?
No,
or
no.
are you usually hands off that?
Everything's in real life, and literally everybody we've dealt with has absolutely no issue. They're quite excited. I'm sure people who, they'll just say, oh, there's a schedule conflict, but actually they might be COVID shy.
You were mentioning before kind of there's something different about IRL events, even if we have to relearn what they're about. We've just spent the last 2 years learning to live alone and like work separately, work remote, hybrid, whatever. What's the value proposition of Collision or an IRL tech event right now in 2022? Like, how do you sell it differently? Do you say like, hey, we're back, or is it a new presentation?
Yeah, not really. I mean, you look at the number of startups that are kind of on the floor that are part of our programs. It's increased by a full just over 50% compared to 2019. So all the momentum got pulled from under us, and yet the demand of, at least for Collision, seems to be incredibly heightened as compared to 2019. There's lots of ways of measuring that. The floor space sold out in April. I think there's the pandemic and working from home is great for maintaining relationships, but for a lot of software companies, especially on the BD side, whether they're selling to developers or anybody else, making new relationships are a lot richer when you meet somebody in real life. I don't know. I suspect that all conferences are benefiting. We're seeing a number, I can only talk about us, but there's a number of trends. First, I should say that conferences that were at the early part of the year, the first quarter, I think, hurt an awful lot. And it was unfortunate. So South by, depending on who you listen to, so I don't know the real number, attendance was down quite dramatically compared to the kind of pre-pandemic. I'm sure there's lots of reasons, but I think the biggest reason was it was in March and it was still just a little bit early in North America for that. And the same for a bunch of other events that were earlier in the year. So I think we're just benefiting by the timing. June just happens to be a good time. Omicron has kind of faded, at least from public imagination. The second thing that seems clear is we're benefiting from a lot of group sales, much more so than we did in the past. So, okay, you dig into that, what's happening? There are teams within companies and companies themselves who are looking for moments now that they're mostly working remote to meet up.
Oh, to like actually meet each other in person or get connected.
Exactly. And so, they can combine a conference, which hopefully is great fun. There's some business done at it. There's some learning from it. And I think as a consequence, a lot of global events at a certain scale will benefit massively from a world where more people are working remote than prior to the pandemic. And the change that we observe is the number of people buying, teams and companies buying group tickets and using it as a sort of offsite or kind of tentpole moment to bring a larger number of people together.
That's really interesting. Do you have metrics for success for this year, given how it's been like, this is kind of like year 2 in year 4 kind of circumstance? Because I'm wondering, you had mentioned, you kind of alluded to something that I think I'd want to note for our listeners to understand. Whereas when it was announced that Collision was coming, that Canadian Tech got Collision, really big deal.
Mm-hmm.
And then a minute later, it followed to a natural local ecosystem provider. Like, well, what's the value of us going to this event? Is it really worth like that kind of like, it's here and now we can ignore it, which is a very Toronto vibe culturally. I have not been feeling that this year. In fact, what's been happening is that my calendar has been filling up with all of the evening events.
There's just so many parties and dinners. We tried to keep track of them. It's like, okay, that's 100 on Tuesday night.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. Yeah. Listeners, move your event to like Thursday evening and people will show up. Is that part of that group connection thing that you're seeing? Like, how are you trying to measure success?
Oh yeah, it's a good question. So internally, the most important singular metric is what we call meaningful connections. And that's, as best we can measure, how many people have met new people that, from what we can infer, they likely did not know each other before the event. All of our software is built to try and encourage people to meet each other, scheduling meetings, sharing details by scanning somebody's badge. If you're meeting a friend, you probably don't scan their badge. But if you're meeting somebody who's new, you're probably scanning their badge. And then if you're subsequently maybe following up over the app, or we can infer from your interaction of that new contact within the app, or you export your contacts from the app, we begin to kind of measure that. So that's
just capturing value from being in the event.
So in my view, of course we have ratings for speakers, and investors get rated and startups get rated. But actually what matters most is people meeting people. So the whole conference then, as a consequence, from the software to the floor layout to the evening events, is all about driving meaningful connections. I think that's the primary purpose of a conference. The speakers create the excuse. And the speakers, I should just say, from our point of view, our job, and I think the pandemic gave us an opportunity to pause for a while and think about, well, why were people coming to our events in the first place? Mm. It wasn't because we were putting on stage today's big names, the established status quo within tech or within any other industry. It was because the role of Web Summit was where you went to hopefully discover some element of the future, or a cohort of companies that you didn't really know who they were, but they actually could turn out to be quite big 3 or 4 years from now. I think we may have got seduced by fame and big names and certain types of people pre the pandemic. And for Collision, we've tried to reset that a little bit with lots of names on stage that I hope people don't know who they are, and they decide, I might just hang out for this talk.
Is it just speakers? Is it thematic in terms of approach? I know one of the questions I had is like, how do you balance speaking to and representing this innovation ecosystem versus bringing kind of like the broader topics that startups are facing here? I know, like, again, that very Canadian vibe is like, oh, we love the Collisions here, but like, we don't want to see only Canadian speakers, but if there's not enough Canadian representation, we're going to
no, you'll never
send a tersely worded email.
You'll never satisfy. In Portugal, we could always create more space for more Portuguese names. We see Collision as a global event, so people are coming here from all over the world, and if Toronto benefits, or Torontonians benefit, or Canadians benefit, that's an incidental outcome of the event being here. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is connect an industry at a global level. And we don't sort of pretend, in my view, that our primary objective is to benefit Canada. If we run a really successful event and lots of the best investors, best journalists, best companies from around the world come to Toronto, then I think there is a second order consequence of that should be very beneficial to the overall ecosystem. But bear in mind, I think in the last 6 months, there's so much fire and uncertainty afflicting some of the big names in Canadian tech that I just don't think even people know how to process, how they might even participate in collision without just getting smacked around on stage by
Yes, and we're not used to that.
somebody from, maybe the Globe. I shouldn't say the Globe and Mail, but I think oftentimes at the moment a lot of journalists only have pretty heavy questions for some of the tech darlings of the last decade.
Yeah.
And so
And Canadian tech companies, particularly public companies, aren't used to having to answer for their share price dropping 80% over the last 6 to 9 months, right? We just got used to IPOing like the year before. We're not used to now being
so
held accountable
I mean,
for.
everybody I meet keeps asking me, they're like, oh, but where's Shopify? Are they not at the event?
Whither Toby?
How is that possible? And I'm like, look, I think it's good. I think they've got priorities right now, and their priorities are, they're not hungry to sit on stage and answer kind of difficult questions. They're hungry to have their heads down, figuring out difficult problems that they now face. And that's the inevitable and normal life cycle of most of these companies.
Given the current, I think not just what's happening to Canadian companies, but just what happened in the crypto market yesterday, public valuations, private valuations. It's for people who haven't experienced 2008, or maybe who came into the ecosystem 5 to even 10 years ago, who have only experienced things being incredibly positive and capital everywhere, haven't been familiar with downturns or bumps in the road. Does that change the content or your economic considerations as a business? Because I believe the first year of Collision was presented as a bit of a, if not a loss leader, a bit of a break even.
Yeah.
And then you had to build a digital event and now you're coming back. So is this a profitable endeavor for you?
No, not this year either. And maybe it will be kind of in the future, but these things are kind of long. And I think Collision is fast becoming within North America, certainly. I'm not too sure there are any events at the scale or quality anymore. There certainly were. I think the pandemic has been hard on a couple of major events, and
flight to quality.
Yeah, possibly.
Does the economic downturn impact the content or the conversation?
Yeah, no, it does, because I think we can see from our programming already, because people are adding certain talks to their schedule. When the world becomes uncertain, everybody starts searching for answers, and so gatherings then of tons of smart people who allegedly are at the frontiers of all of this change and disruption are interesting to listen to. And I think when everything is really certain, why would you want to fill up your schedule with 10 or 12 talks? You're kind of like, I'm just going to do the networking part. I'm focused on the business and we've got it nailed down. We know what we're doing. But now the world's been turned upside down. So suddenly everybody's like, I need to figure some stuff out. I'm going to go to that talk and that talk. And so I think you're going to see an interest in high quality journalism that's trying to dig into some of the major questions that are now emerging in crypto and elsewhere.
Regulatory stability as well, possibly?
Yes, a little bit of that. I mean, crypto's so wild, it's unbelievable.
Do you want to work where your imagination makes an impact? Join Tech at RBC, a fast-paced team of innovators working to create positive change for their clients and communities. At RBC, you'll build a meaningful career while working on high-impact projects with some of the top tech and business experts in the country. RBC is hiring for a range of tech positions, from developers to data scientists to cybersecurity professionals and more. So if you want to make an impact, you need to check out the latest roles at jobs.rbc.com/tech.
Do you want to maybe highlight some of the sessions that you're looking to, you were just mentioning names people might not recognize, but might be the type of session where they're going to get some insight? Or I know Beatty Kits, we're moderating a bunch of panels this week. I don't our listeners will hear about us promoting that, but from your perspective.
So I'm always very careful that I don't alienate 98% of our speakers by saying that 2% of them are fantastic. But
they're not going to hear this podcast.
I mean, very personally, the stuff I often like and watch back actually happens to be a little bit more in the regulatory space, future of media. I have my own views about fake news. I think it's a fake problem, but amplified by traditional media in a desperate attempt to drive subscription revenue by telling everybody that they can't believe anything else that's out there. All of the most credible academics in the space studying the topic for the last half decade have been screaming to the point that their voices are now exhausted that fake news is a fake problem. Every which way they try to measure it, it's just no more or no less a problem than it was historically. And there is no larger percentage of the population that's likely to believe misinformed news reporting. And if you look at the Columbia Journalism Review is probably one of the better sources, and they publish all sorts of interesting analyses of the news media. It's interesting in that I'm kind of very left of center person. Towards the fringes of the far right, there is this, what you may assume is a conspiracy theory, where they say that the mainstream media are responsible for the promulgation of most of the fake news that exists.
George Soros and the Bill Gates chips in our
But unfortunately, when, within formal political science, media studies, when they go and attempt to measure this, it does seem to be true that the mainstream media may not intend to mislead people, but when they get it wrong, unfortunately, a lot of people trust them, and they can end up misinforming a huge breadth of the population. And every editor working in the Globe and Mail or the New York Times is acutely aware of that, and they oftentimes will come out and apologize when they, get something very wrong, as happened with the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times on Hunter Biden's laptop. They said it was some sort of conspiracy, but his laptop and the contents on it were actually real.
Well, okay, so let's talk a bit about that, because that's not a conversation that our listeners would be unfamiliar with, because we usually use this podcast as a way to kind of expand to the broader themes of tech. And as a media entrepreneur myself, working in the tech space, we've had people like Craig Silverman on from BuzzFeed, who's done a lot of work identifying the way that technology can amplify traditional attempts at misinformation, or the fact that at the scale of technology, the cost of misinformation is zero. And it can actually be speculative. So there can be intrinsic value. But I also look at something last week where you've got the January 6th hearings in the United States, and every major broadcast network is showing those hearings. And then Fox News is running programming against it and not running any commercials to prevent their audience from clicking away. So I'm just wondering, and I guess that's not a technological consideration, but are there things that you have to look at when you're putting, because you're a media entity,
sure,
right?
Yeah. Well, we try and bring some degree of diversity in the voices that appear on stage at our events. And over the years, we've platformed some of the most important whistleblowers of the last decade. You can go back to Web Summit in November. The kind of star attraction for most journalists was Frances Haugen, who was the then sort of woman of the moment with her revelations about Facebook. We like to have hard discussions about market abuses, taxation. I think when a lot of other conferences fixated over the last decade on philanthropy, we're like, well, great that people are giving things to noble causes, but they should also pay
Taxes instead, yeah.
Some fucking taxes. In terms of, my views are kind of unimportant. We're just acting almost like a bit of a parliament. We're sort of like the Speaker of the House. We're trying to facilitate debate on both sides. And sometimes there's more than two sides. There are many sides to some of these debates. So when it comes to coups in Washington, D.C., I mean, the U.S. knows an awful lot about coups in previously
military engagement,
it's a topic they're very familiar with.
I think you and I can host a separate podcast where we just have our political takes. I want to steer this back, although I find this very interesting. I will note here that I think that you have an interest in, probably more so than most events, having a more sophisticated conversation on stage about some of these topics, to the point of not just being, I think this ecosystem is more familiar with a rallying cry, a rah-rah, support our ecosystem. And I think maybe some of the tension with events like Collision is that you just don't have any interest in that, let alone time for it. Like, you're here to have a more
you can't really launch your product on stage. That's every other event, not every other event, but a lot of other events seem to do that. It's like, oh, welcome to the stage, one of our main sponsors. They're going to talk about this awesome new feature.
Why they care about diversity,
and it's like, no, let's have a grown-up adult discussion about this. And look, you may think the journalist has just been mean to you on stage, but actually most people in the audience just think it's kind of fair. line of questioning, and that makes it a little bit more engaging. So, we've tons of stages running concurrently. Some of them see thousands of people, and we wouldn't have as many stages and have as many seats unless some element of the content was engaging. It's not all engaging, don't get me wrong. We watch back and we're pretty ruthless about kind of cutting people that just are shit on stage, sorry. And we don't always get it right. Sometimes get it very wrong. Maybe we're a media organization. I mean, really, we're trying to facilitate media coming to the event and getting interesting stories and angles.
I only mean it in such as that you create content, you create conversations, you're a space for that, whether that's a website, a podcast, in person. Like, we've run our own events. I feel it's like two sides of the same coin, and I hate events running them myself because I want the quality of the content to be something similar to that I know that we can produce in the written form. I'm like, this is easier. I feel like at least we're similar in our initial intention, even if the articulation is different. I mean, maybe let's talk about this, because you've been at this for some time now. Forget Collision, add in Web Summit, every other event. Like, you've got 2 web summits now. You're doing one in Rio as well.
Yeah, we have an event in Asia as well, and maybe in 2024, 2025 we'll add some events in Africa and the Middle East as well.
So I guess, what's your horizon for, like, you're just still committed to it, building it? Like, what's
I get to work with, over time we've built an amazing team that I love working with, and we just want to, our aim is to build the best events in the world. That sounds obnoxious, but hopefully they're just good. And we want to build great event software and let other events use that software. It's useful to us in executing our events, and we think it should be useful to others. That's what we do. And if along the way we trigger kind of interesting conversations that lead to, The Social Dilemma, which was a Netflix documentary, came partly about because I knew the executive editor of 60 Minutes in the United States, and we were chatting about, the underbelly of Silicon Valley, and did I think there were any interesting stories that nobody was talking about? And I was like, oh, well, Tristan Harris is this incredible individual who nobody knows that he's really incredible. He's this very powerful story to tell. And, a phone call later, the editor of kind of 60 Minutes was talking to Tristan. 3 weeks later, 60 Minutes do this big kind of reveal. This is about kind of 4 years ago now. That leads to kind of a TED talk, a Sam Harris podcast, Joe Rogan podcast. And suddenly a lot of the issues that Tristan and others were highlighting with regard to kind of addiction and, potential for manipulation on social media platforms becomes kind of very mainstream. And as a consequence, I think there's some positive moves towards reasonable, mature kind of regulation, or just new rules for new platforms in different countries kind of around the world. And some of that stuff is, it's kind of fun to see that happen.
You do have a truly global lens of what's happening because you're in every market.
Yeah. We've lots of, we've doing stuff in Hong Kong. We've become very close to, lots of the Chinese companies, Chinese investors, Chinese media. We've lots of Chinese folks working for us, and you can see the other side sometimes, because increasingly I think the world's getting a little bit fractured, and people are retreating into kind of a Disney narrative of the world, us and them. And them, well, they're just unimaginable autocrats. They're crazy, and all they want are bad things. And it's like, I don't really know if the world is that simple. It's a bit more nuanced.
Do you think that this year's Collision, with the immense output of social events and like outdoor spaces, is going to combat that, or is it a catalyst to more fragmentation? Like, is there a way back? Can we roll back to prior versions of ourselves as a society, or do you think we're just...
of the world? Yeah, I think we're there. I mean, to take Collision firstly, I would hope that people's experience this year, after effectively a 3-year pause, will help establish, not reinforce, but establish Collision as a very important event in the world, and that will help the event grow, not just in notoriety but in quality and scale in 2023. With events, I think it's a bit kind of all about momentum. Collision only happened once in 2019, and people are like, oh, there's this event in Toronto, that's kind of cool, it's only down the road, I don't have to fly anywhere, I don't have to pay for hotel rooms, maybe I'll go to that next year. Then it kind of disappears, then it's not there the following year either. And so for me, even just locally within Toronto, this is just re-establishing Collision. Yeah. And I think awareness of collision won't actually peak even in Toronto until the week afterwards, when people are like, oh, I heard that was actually quite good. I should have gone to that.
Yes, or when September or November events are canceled again, and they just remember that one fun time in the sun.
I've a feeling as well, Wednesday, so kind of 6 days out from the event, it's going to be sold out. Collision will just kind of reach that kind of threshold. And I feel sometimes it's only then, when people are beginning to have a hard time getting tickets, that they're like, oh, I really want to go to that event.
Yes.
Yeah, I should go to that event.
The amount of emails over the weekend that I will receive to see if I have free access.
Which I'm sure you, above most other people in Toronto, will probably have a couple of tickets kind of squirreled away and media passes.
No, I just filter that stuff out. I don't have time for it.
Okay,
I'm
fine.
As someone who runs a media publication, who has run events. You should pay for your ticket. You should do it. I'm not here for that. Only as media do I get the free.
I will say, Sunil Sharma was showing me his phone yesterday, and I feel so sorry for Sunil. So he's my co-host, and
Sunil did it to himself. He built the network to then have the requests.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking. There weren't minutes passing yesterday evening when people were just asking him for free tickets. And it's not like people that are connected to Tim Cook just constantly go, oh, awesome new laptop. Can I get a free one? Yes. It's strange, but with events.
No, but I think you are renowned for saying that he's one of the most annoying people in Canadian tech event. And that was both the compliment and the criticism, right? Because he was able to get everyone.
He was very persistent.
Yes. He was the most. Yes. Okay. So let's bring this back. I kind of want to ask you about other conversations that Canadian tech media should be covering more because of your perspective. So if you've got something there.
Well, I think Shopify in 2019, I sensed privately a lot of journalists like, oh, what do you think the Shopify thing? I mean, it's not really worth what it's worth. That was when the world was kind of celebrating Shopify, and quite a few kind of traditional Canadian journalists were like, what do you really think? I don't think this Shopify is up to it. And now that the tides have turned and Shopify is getting absolutely beaten up and smashed up, and their valuation has fallen through the floor, and I'm sure that brings with it all sorts of horribleness. No doubt they'll kind of find their way through. But some of the kind of more traditional Canadian journalists I've spoken to over the last number of days are kind of now quite protective of Shopify, because they're like, what's going on at Wall Street? Why are they're giving Shopify an undue hard time, which I think is great. So actually, I think Canada's going to rally around Shopify and kind of hold it in a warm embrace and hope that it finds its way through, which I'm sure Toby and the team will do.
It's so wonderful having you on this podcast to say these things back to our audience, because I don't think they connect. I think part of the reason why that is because if you look historically in terms of Canadian tech, we had Nortel, we had Research in Motion / BlackBerry, and Shopify. Every 10 years, major company, national tall poppy to be celebrated, and then chopped down at a global competitive level. I'm not saying that's happened with Shopify. I actually think that they are better structured to emerge in ways that certainly Research in Motion wasn't, because they had co-CEOs and co-COOs and it was a fucking mess. But I think what you're sensing is that, it's like every Raptors season before the Raptors won in 2019. Here we go again.
Yeah. Oh, I think Canadians like an underdog, and maybe it's the tall poppies that they like to cut down. And now that Shopify sort of feels like an underdog all of a sudden, that's getting a lot of heat from the rest of the world. The attitude towards Shopify now, it's like, I want them to pull out of this.
Wow. It's an underdog that everyone has equity in.
There is that as well. There's kind of but I hearing that they're like, they all got too arrogant over there at Shopify. But this humbling experience will be good for them.
Yeah.
They'll have mass layoffs and it'll be good for them.
Again,
and I'm like, Jesus, Canada, you get such a weird, twisted psychology sometimes. You're so nice and humble.
It's the dual, yes. Yeah. It's that we want to keep everything, we're fighting both urges to celebrate and undermine at all times. You're also probably talking to a lot of people who are finally like, might be a little harder for Shopify to hire some people now too, after stealing all the time. Okay, but this isn't a Shopify podcast. I want to close on this because you're, as you said, a week out. You have a lot of things to do. You need to sell out those tickets and prep for any last minute speaker issues that I'm sure show up at every event. I want to, again, as a Canadian, someone who's lived in Toronto for 10 years, myopically focus back to the city. As you said before, you kind of had one event in 2019. It was like, hey, we're bringing Collision here. Let's figure this out. And then you weren't really able to for 2 years, and now you're back again. Collision has been in a couple of different cities. How did the last 3 years impact your agreement with the city of Toronto Do you still have plans to be here? Like, how did that change the commitment?
Yeah, we just paused it, and we'll be here until kind of 2023. After that, we'll figure things out. I have to say, I loved New Orleans, but we made I would say a bit of a mistake going to New Orleans, because when you're running a regional event, maybe New Orleans is fine because people can fly direct to it. But when you're organizing an international event and nobody can fly direct to that city, and that city is limited in so many ways, that brings all sorts of sort of limitations on the scale or the success of the event. Toronto couldn't be more different, and I think we've benefited massively as a consequence. I will say, though, just one thing that we've come up against, and it's probably because June is quite a busy month. Right now, I know for the next week, for the week of Collision, there's in downtown Toronto, there's only a single 3-star hotel as of yesterday and a single 5-star hotel with rooms left. And
Damn.
the 3-star hotel, I don't know what it works out in Canadian dollars, I should know, but I was looking at it on euros on my booking.com app, was 1,200 euros a night in a 3-star hotel in downtown Toronto. So we're seeing a lot of kind of feedback online. We're trying to direct people towards staying way out of the city at the end of the kind of subway lines, that actually transport is quite good.
Go train in.
You could go to Brampton and you can get a train in. So there are lots of, thankfully, because of the sheer scale of the metro area, or the GTA, is that what people call it? I kind of think of Grand Theft Auto when I think of GTA. But
Don't say that.
Don't say that. Let's say that. GTA 3.
Yeah.
No.
Adopt the mannerisms of the locals. You'll be fine. Yes.
Yeah. Thankfully, the huge scale of Toronto means that even if people can't stay within a walk or a short kind of taxi or Uber of the venue, they can effectively say 30 kilometers away, but they can commute in a very short period of time.
Hopefully the Up Express helps with that, right? Because that basically runs right past the convention center.
Oh,
right?
really? Okay, great. Yeah.
Well, have you? So with the feedback, the hotel thing is interesting because obviously I haven't had to stay anywhere, and certainly not in the city. Have you heard anything about Pearson Airport? Has anyone told you about what's going on there? Is that a concern for your team?
Well, I landed there
because I think when we talked in 2019, we were like, are you sure you can get people from the airport to downtown? Because it was a little tough. And now it's more like, can you get people out of Pearson Airport?
Yes. I mean, when I landed on Sunday, the pilot basically said, look, brace yourselves. We're here, but we're not really here. We could be held for over an hour inside the plane. We're going to kind of keep you updated. And then when you get into the airport, you may not get out of the airport today. And everybody was kind of chuckling at that. And then eventually, after about 30 minutes, somebody came onto the plane and said, we've got good news. You're going to be allowed off the plane, but only in groups of 20 at intervals that we will decide. And so cool. I think roughly every 5 or 10 minutes, they were letting people off the plane. But actually, when I got into the airport, I flew through it. It just seems certain times of the day is not ideal to arrive. Look, it's a good problem. It means there's lots of people suddenly flying into Toronto. They didn't foresee it. The staffing levels probably aren't there. Or maybe the airport's just at capacity.
Or possibly given up. But I think, I appreciate your optimism. I don't think you can solve all of the city's problems. But I appreciate the way that you intersect with the city and try to make something compelling happen. And as well as your honesty about the current state of the ecosystem. So I'm sure you have to go to do many, many things. I hope we get a chance to reconnect maybe towards the end of the conference and maybe do a catch up on how you
it'll be interesting. I mean, look, people forget in 2019 the Wi-Fi largely broke for all of the 3 days. It was absolutely
for me the singular event was when the fire
fire alarm went off. The Wi-Fi broke. We had such issues with the food. We've resolved that this year. The city have been extraordinary.
It was a beta launch.
Yeah. It's amazing how people forget all of these things, but they were so visceral for us. And there were huge queues, there were issues with security, and you learn. And hopefully 2022 will be better.
Knock on wood.
The Beta Kid podcast is produced by Beta Kid Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.